Sarah, when you first saw that treehouse, what went through your mind?
Honestly, Tony, I was just thinking about how much firewood it would make. I know that sounds terrible, but I was 3 months behind on rent. My daughter needed school supplies, and here's this rotting wooden structure my grandmother never even mentioned. I climbed up there planning to tear it down, maybe sell the lumber, but when I pulled up that first loose board, everything changed. There was this metal box underneath, and inside it, well, let me just say I went from counting pennies to staring at more money than I'd ever seen in my life.
But that money came with a price, didn't it?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Sarah, thank you for joining me today. I know this isn't an easy story to share, but I think our listeners need to hear about what happened to you and your family. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your grandmother's property and what it meant to you growing up.
Well, Tony, my grandmother Evelyn lived on this beautiful piece of land about 40 minutes outside the city. 23 acres of old-growth oak and maple trees, with a creek running right through the middle of it. As a child, I spent every summer there. The main house was this charming 2-story farmhouse built in the 1940s, painted yellow with white shutters. My grandmother always kept a vegetable garden behind the house and flower boxes under every window.
It sounds idyllic. What was your relationship like with your grandmother?
Oh, she was everything to me, Tony. After my parents divorced when I was 8, my mother would send me to stay with Grandma Evelyn for weeks at a time. She had this way of making everything feel magical. We'd spend hours in her kitchen making jam from the wild blackberries that grew along the creek, and she'd tell me stories about the land, about the families who had lived there before us.
Those sound like precious memories. Now, when you inherited the property, you were going through some difficult times yourself, weren't you?
Long pause. Yes, that's putting it mildly. I had just gone through a terrible divorce. My ex-husband had drained our savings account and disappeared, leaving me with massive credit card debt and a mortgage I couldn't afford. I was working 2 part-time jobs just to keep food on the table for my daughter Emma. She was 12 at the time, and I was watching her grow up in hand-me-down clothes, never able to sign her up for the activities her friends were doing.
That must have been incredibly stressful. How did you first learn about the inheritance?
Grandma Evelyn's lawyer called me on a Tuesday morning. I remember because I was getting ready for my shift at the diner, and Emma was sick with a fever. I almost didn't answer the phone. He told me that my grandmother had left the entire property to me, along with about $15,000 in her savings account. I just sat there in my tiny apartment kitchen, staring at the peeling linolette, unable to process what he was saying.
What was your first instinct? Did you think about selling the property right away?
Honestly, Tony, yes. I knew the land had to be worth at least $200,000, maybe more. In my mind, I was already calculating how much I could pay off, whether we could find a decent apartment in a better school district for Emma. But part of me felt this overwhelming guilt. This was the place where I had been happiest as a child. Selling it felt like betraying my grandmother's memory.
So you decided to visit the property first?
I took Emma with me on a Saturday morning in late September. The leaves were just starting to turn, and as we drove up that long gravel driveway, I felt this mixture of nostalgia and sadness. The house looked smaller than I remembered, and there were shutters hanging at odd angles. The flower boxes were empty, filled with nothing but dried stems and weeds.
How did your daughter react to seeing the property?
Emma was 12, and going through that phase where everything her mother did was embarrassing or boring. She spent the first hour sitting in the car, texting her friends and complaining about not having good cell service. But something about the place started to work its magic on her, just like it had on me all those years ago. She heard the creek bubbling and asked if she could go explore.
And that's when you made the discovery that changed everything?
Not right away. We spent that first day just wandering around the property, going through the house room by room. Everything was exactly as my grandmother had left it. Her reading glasses were still on the kitchen table next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Her coffee mug was in the sink. It was like she had just stepped out for a moment.
That must have been emotionally overwhelming.
It was, Tony. I found myself crying in her bedroom, holding one of her sweaters that still smelled like her lavender perfume. Emma found me there and just sat beside me on the bed. We talked about Grandma Evelyn, about the stories she used to tell us. That's when Emma mentioned something that caught my attention.
What did she say?
She said she remembered a treehouse somewhere on the property. I had completely forgotten about it, but as soon as she mentioned it, I could picture it clearly. It was built in this massive oak tree, about a quarter-mile into the woods, near where the creek bends. My grandmother had shown it to me when I was very young, maybe 6 or 7 years old.
Did you remember much about the treehouse itself?
Just fragments, really. I recalled climbing up this rope ladder and being amazed by how sturdy it was, how well built. My grandmother had told me that someone had constructed it years before we owned the property, back in the 1960s or early 70s. She said it had been built by a young man who used to work for the previous owner, helping with odd jobs around the property.
So you and Emma decided to look for it?
The next day, Sunday, we packed a picnic lunch and set out to find it. I wasn't even sure it would still be standing after all these years. We followed the creek, pushing through overgrown brush and fallen branches. Emma was actually excited about the adventure, which was the first time I'd seen her genuinely happy in months.
And when you found it?
Pause. Tony. It was like stepping back in time. The treehouse was still there, weathered but incredibly solid. Someone had built it to last. It wasn't just a few boards nailed together like most kids' treehouses. This was a real structure, probably 8 feet by 10 feet, with proper joints and even small windows cut into the sides.
How did it look after all those years?
The wood had turned this beautiful silver-gray color, and there were vines growing up the sides. The rope ladder was long gone, rotted away, but Emma found some fallen branches that we could stack up to reach the entrance. I was nervous about the structure's integrity, but when I tested the floor, it felt completely solid.
What was your first impression when you actually got inside?
It was dark, obviously, but Emma had brought a flashlight. The interior was larger than it looked from outside. There was even a small bench built along one wall, and what looked like shelving on the other side. Everything was covered in years of dust and leaves that had blown in through the windows.
Did you find anything interesting right away?
At first, just the usual things you'd expect. Some old glass bottles, a few rusty tools, what looked like the remains of a transistor radio. But Emma was fascinated by the whole place. She started sweeping out the debris with a branch, talking about how we could fix it up, maybe use it as a getaway spot when we moved to the property.
You were considering moving there permanently?
The idea was starting to appeal to me, Tony. I realized I could sell my grandmother's house but keep a few acres, maybe put a small mobile home on the property. It would give Emma space to run around, and the cost of living would be so much lower than in the city. Plus, there was something healing about being in a place that held so many good memories.
So this treehouse discovery was factoring into your future plans?
Absolutely. Emma was more excited about that treehouse than I'd seen her about anything in years. She spent the entire afternoon up there, imagining how we could clean it up, talking about bringing books and art supplies. For the first time since the divorce, I saw glimpses of the happy, creative child she used to be.
It sounds like the property was already working its healing magic on both of you.
It really was. That night we stayed in my grandmother's house, and I slept better than I had in months. There's something about being surrounded by all that nature, hearing the creek and the wind in the trees. Emma fell asleep reading one of my grandmother's old books by lamplight.
So when did you decide to take a closer look at the treehouse structure itself?
The following weekend. I had been thinking about it all week, wondering about the person who had built it. My grandmother had mentioned him briefly, but I realized I didn't know much about the property's history before our family owned it. I started to get curious about the craftsmanship, about why someone would put so much work into building something so substantial.
What specifically made you want to investigate further?
Emma had mentioned that some of the floorboards seemed loose, and I was worried about safety. I thought maybe I should check the structural integrity before she spent more time up there. I brought some basic tools with me, thinking I might need to nail down a few boards, or remove any that were damaged.
And your grandmother had never mentioned anything unusual about the treehouse?
Not that I could recall, Tony. She had always been somewhat vague about the previous owners of the property. I knew the land had been owned by a family called the Hendersons, and that they had sold it to my grandmother in 1978. But she never talked much about why they sold, or what the relationship was like between our families.
Did that strike you as odd, looking back?
Pause. My grandmother was a private person in some ways. She loved to tell stories, but they were usually about nature, about the changing seasons, about local folklore. When it came to specific people or events, she could be surprisingly reserved. I always assumed she was just respecting people's privacy.
So you went back to examine the treehouse more carefully.
Yes. And Emma insisted on coming with me. She had been talking about that treehouse all week, drawing pictures of how we could decorate it, making lists of things we could store there. I think she was starting to see our potential new life on the property as an adventure, rather than just another consequence of our financial problems.
That must have been a relief for you as a mother.
Oh, Tony, it was everything. For months, I had been watching Emma withdraw into herself, becoming quiet and serious in ways that no 12-year-old should have to be. Seeing her excitement about something, watching her make plans for the future, it gave me hope that maybe I hadn't completely ruined her childhood with all the chaos of the divorce.
So you both climbed up to examine those loose floorboards?
We did, and initially everything seemed normal. A couple of the boards near the back corner were indeed loose, probably just from years of weather and the natural expansion and contraction of the wood. I started to pry them up carefully, thinking I would just reset them properly.
But something was different about what you found underneath?
Long pause, Tony. What we discovered under those boards changed everything. Not just our plans for the property, not just our financial situation, but our understanding of who we were and what we had inherited. In that moment, kneeling on the dusty floor of that treehouse with my daughter beside me, I had no idea that we were about to uncover a secret that people had been keeping for more than 40 years.
And that's when you realized you weren't just inheriting property, you were inheriting a mystery.
Exactly. A mystery that was about to turn our lives upside down in ways I never could have imagined.
Sarah, let's talk about your grandmother's property. When you first inherited it, what was your initial reaction to the place itself?
Oh, Tony, it was overwhelming. I hadn't been there since I was maybe 12 years old. The house sat on these 4 acres of overgrown land, thick with old oak trees and wild blackberry bushes that had completely taken over what used to be her garden. The paint was peeling off the shutters, and there were shingles missing from the roof. I remember standing there with my daughter Emma, both of us just staring at this place that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale that had gone wrong.
What did Emma think of it?
She was 8 at the time, and you know how children see magic where adults see problems. She kept pointing to different corners of the property, asking if we could explore this path or climb that tree. There was this old rope swing hanging from a massive oak near the back of the house, and she made me promise we'd fix it up. I was thinking about property taxes and repair costs, and she was already planning adventures.
Tell me about your grandmother. What kind of woman was she?
Long pause. Grandmother Rose was. She was complicated. My mother always said Rose was a woman who kept her own counsel. She lived alone on that property for nearly 40 years after my grandfather died. She had this way of looking at you like she could see right through whatever you were trying to hide. When I was little, I thought she could read minds.
Did you visit her often as a child?
Every summer until I was about 13. My parents would drop me off for 2 weeks, and I'd spend my days following Rose around as she tended her enormous vegetable garden and fed the wild birds that gathered on her back porch. She knew every tree on that property by heart, Tony. She'd tell me stories about which ones were good for climbing, which ones the birds preferred for nesting. She had names for some of them.
Names for the trees?
The big oak with the rope swing was called Solomon because she said he was wise enough to hold the weight of every child who'd ever swung from his branches. There was a cluster of pine trees near the eastern border she called the Three Sisters. And there was this old maple. Pause, she called it the Keeper.
That's an unusual name. Did she ever explain what it was keeping?
She'd get this distant look in her eyes whenever we walked past it. She'd say some trees hold memories better than people do. I thought it was just the kind of poetic thing grandmothers say to make the world seem more mysterious to their grandchildren. Now I wonder if she meant something more literal.
What happened to your relationship with her as you got older?
Life happened, I suppose. High school, then college. Then I got married young to a man who didn't much care for family obligations. Rose sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, but I was so caught up in trying to make my marriage work that I barely called her. When Emma was born, Rose drove 4 hours to the hospital to meet her. She held that tiny baby and looked at me with such sadness in her eyes.
Sadness?
She said something I'll never forget. She said, "Sarah, some mistakes echo through generations, but love does too. Make sure you know which one you're passing down." At the time, I thought she was just being dramatic. Rose always had a flair for the dramatic.
When did you last see her alive?
2 years before she passed. Emma was 6, and we made a day trip to visit. The property looked different then, more wild than I remembered. Rose seemed smaller somehow, but her mind was still sharp. She spent most of the afternoon teaching Emma how to identify different bird calls. She kept saying Emma had good ears, that she could hear things other people missed.
Did Rose ever mention anything about the property's history, previous owners, or anything unusual that might have happened there?
She'd hint at things. She once told me the land had seen both joy and sorrow, which I assumed meant she was thinking about my grandfather's death. He had a heart attack while splitting firewood behind the house. But sometimes she'd make these cryptic comments about neighbors, about how some people in the area had long memories for old grievances.
What kind of neighbors?
The Hendersons owned the farm to the north. Rose always spoke fondly of them. But there was another family, the Millers, who had property that bordered the southern edge. Rose would get this tight expression around her mouth whenever their name came up. She'd say some people plant their roots too deep in other folks' business.
Did you ever meet the Millers?
Once, when I was maybe 10. A man came to the door while Rose and I were making jam. He was tall, had these pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Rose spoke to him on the front porch, while I watched from the kitchen window. She never raised her voice, but I could tell she was angry from the way she held her shoulders. After he left, she came inside and said some people don't know when to let sleeping dogs lie.
Do you remember his first name?
I think she called him Dutch Miller. After he left, Rose went straight to her bedroom and stayed there for the rest of the afternoon. I found her sitting on the edge of her bed, staring out the window toward the tree line. She looked so small and tired.
When you inherited the property, were there any legal complications? Other family members who might have expected to inherit?
Rose outlived most of her generation, and my mother had passed 2 years before Rose did. The lawyer said the will was straightforward. Rose left everything to me, along with a sealed letter that said I should take time to really see the property before making any decisions about selling it.
Did that strike you as odd advice?
Everything about Rose was a little odd, Tony. I thought she meant I should appreciate the sentimental value before letting it go for practical reasons. I was behind on rent. Emma needed new school clothes, and my car was making sounds that promised expensive repairs. I figured I'd spend a weekend cleaning up the house enough to put it on the market.
But you didn't sell it right away.
No. Pause. Something about being there felt unfinished. Emma loved it so much, and honestly, it was the first time in years I'd seen her truly excited about anything. My divorce had been hard on her, and she'd become this quiet, careful child who seemed afraid to want things too much. But on that property, she was fearless again.
So you decided to stay.
We moved in that fall. It wasn't easy. The house needed so much work, and we were living on my part-time income and what little savings I had left. But Emma thrived there. She'd spend hours exploring, always coming back with stories about what she'd discovered. She found old garden tools in the shed, a family of rabbits living under the back porch, and, well, that's when she started talking about the treehouse.
Even then, you had no idea it existed.
None whatsoever, and neither, it seemed, did anyone else.
So Sarah, you mentioned finding this treehouse on your grandmother's property. Tell me about that first moment when you actually climbed up there. What did you see?
Long pause. The boards creaked something terrible under my feet, Tony. I remember thinking I might fall right through, but when I pushed open that little door, it was like stepping back in time. Everything was covered in this thick layer of dust, and the air smelled like old wood and something else. Something sweet and musty.
Sweet and musty. That's an interesting combination. What was causing that smell?
There were these old mason jars lined up on a shelf, filled with what used to be wildflowers. Completely dried out, of course, but you could still make out the shapes. And there was this little wooden table, child-sized, with 2 chairs pushed up against it. Like someone had just gotten up and left.
2 chairs. So your grandmother wasn't playing up there alone?
No, definitely not. There were these faded drawings tacked to the walls, crayon pictures of horses and houses with smoke coming from the chimneys. Some were signed with my grandmother's name, but others had a different name scrawled at the bottom. The handwriting was so young you could barely make it out.
What did you know about your grandmother's childhood before this discovery?
Honestly, very little. She was always so focused on the present when I was growing up. She'd tell me stories about when my mother was young, or about her garden or her recipes, but ask her about her own childhood, and she'd get this distant look in her eyes and change the subject.
That must have made this discovery even more meaningful for you.
It felt like I was meeting her for the first time, in a way. Seeing her as this young girl who picked wildflowers and drew pictures, and had a best friend to share secrets with. There was this innocence to that little space that made my chest tight.
You said there were personal items up there. Can you describe some of them?
There was a small wooden box, painted blue but chipped and faded. Inside were these tiny treasures. A few marbles, some buttons that looked like they came from fancy dresses, and this little locket on a tarnished chain. When I opened it, there was a picture of two girls, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with their arms around each other's shoulders.
And you recognized one of them as your grandmother?
She had the same eyes. Even as a child, she had these deep, thoughtful eyes that seemed to see everything. The other girl was blonde with pigtails, laughing at something outside the frame. They looked so happy together, Tony, so carefree.
What else was in that treehouse that caught your attention?
There was this old quilt spread across the floor, probably meant to make sitting more comfortable. It was handmade with these intricate patterns in blues and yellows. Even through all the dust and years, you could see the care that went into every stitch. And in one corner, there was a stack of old books. Children's stories, mostly. But the pages were yellowed and some were water damaged.
It sounds like this was a very special place for your grandmother and her friend.
It was their sanctuary, I think. There were these little rules written on a piece of paper and pinned to the wall. Things like no grown-ups allowed, and always bring something to share, and keep all secrets safe forever. That last one gave me chills when I read it.
Why do you think that particular rule affected you so strongly?
Maybe because I was carrying so many secrets of my own at the time. The bills I couldn't pay, the worry about my kids' future, the shame of not being able to provide the way I wanted to. Reading those words, written in a child's careful handwriting, made me realize that everyone has secrets they're protecting.
Tell me more about the condition of the treehouse itself. Had it been maintained over the years?
That's what was so strange, Tony. From the outside, it looked completely forgotten. Overgrown with vines, some of the exterior boards were rotting. But inside, it was like someone had sealed it away carefully. The roof didn't leak, the floor was solid, and everything was arranged just so. Like it was waiting for someone to come back.
Did you get the sense that your grandmother had been back there recently?
I wondered about that. There was this feeling, like the space was still loved, even if it hadn't been visited. Maybe she thought about it often, even if she couldn't bring herself to climb up there again.
What was going through your mind as you explored this hidden part of her life?
Sadness, mostly, and guilt for never asking the right questions when I had the chance. Here was this whole friendship, this whole world that had meant everything to her, and I knew nothing about it. I kept thinking about all the conversations we could have had, all the stories she could have shared.
Did finding this place change how you thought about your grandmother?
Completely. I'd always seen her as this practical, no-nonsense woman who focused on what needed to be done. But sitting in that treehouse, surrounded by those childhood treasures, I realized she had this deep well of emotion and memory that she kept private. It made me love her more, but it also made me sad for what she carried alone.
And you said your kids were with you when you first found it?
They were exploring the yard while I was dealing with the house. When I called them over to see what I'd found, their eyes lit up the same way mine probably did. Children recognize magic when they see it, even magic that's decades old.
What was their reaction to the treehouse?
They wanted to know everything. Whose drawings were those? Who lived here? Could they play here too? Their excitement reminded me that some places hold joy that transcends time. Even covered in dust and filled with memories of people they'd never meet, it was still a place where children had been happy.
So, you'd been living in your grandmother's house for what, about 3 weeks at that point?
Just over 3 weeks. Yes. Emma had finally stopped asking when we were going back to our old apartment, and I was starting to believe maybe we could actually make this work.
That must have felt like a relief after everything you'd been through.
It was the first time in months I'd gone to bed without that knot in my stomach, you know? The one that comes from wondering how you're going to pay for groceries, or whether the electricity will still be on tomorrow.
And then Emma came running in from the backyard.
Pause. She burst through that kitchen door like the house was on fire. I was washing dishes at the sink, trying to figure out what we could make for dinner with a can of tomatoes and some pasta, when I heard her feet pounding up the back steps.
What did she say exactly?
Mom, you have to come see this. There's a house in the tree, a real house. She was practically vibrating with excitement, tugging on my sleeve with wet hands because she'd been playing with the garden hose.
Your first thought was probably that she'd found some old boards or a birdhouse.
Exactly. I told her to slow down, that maybe it was just some old wood that had gotten stuck up there after a storm. But she kept insisting. She said it had windows, Tony. Windows and a door and everything.
So you decided to investigate.
I couldn't say no to that face, and honestly, I was curious myself. Grandma Rose had never mentioned anything about a treehouse, and I thought I knew every inch of that property from my childhood visits.
Describe what you saw when you first walked into that backyard.
The oak tree was massive, probably 100 years old or more. I'd climbed it as a kid, but I'd never ventured very high. But there, maybe 15 feet up, was this structure that looked like something out of a storybook.
How big was it?
Maybe 8 feet by 6 feet. Small, but substantial. Real wooden walls, not just some boards nailed together. There was a little window with actual glass panes, and a door that someone had painted green, though the paint was peeling now.
Had it been there when you were a child visiting your grandmother?
That's what I couldn't understand. I stared at that treehouse for the longest time, trying to remember. But Tony, I'm telling you, if that had been there when I was Emma's age, I would have lived in it. There's no way I would have forgotten something like that.
What did Emma want to do?
Climb up there, of course. She'd already figured out the ladder situation. Someone had nailed wooden slats into the trunk, making a kind of rough stairway. She was halfway up before I could stop her.
Were you worried about safety?
Terrified. Those boards looked old, and I had no idea how sturdy that structure was. I made her come down while I tested each step myself. But Tony, they were solid. Whoever built that treehouse knew what they were doing.
So you climbed up first.
My heart was racing the whole way up. Not just from the height, but from the strange feeling that I was about to discover something important. Something that would change things.
What was that feeling based on?
I keep asking myself that same question. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light was hitting the windows, or how quiet the backyard suddenly seemed. But as I got closer to that little door, I felt like I was walking into a secret that had been waiting for me.
And when you opened the door?
Long pause. It was like stepping back in time. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, but I could see it had been someone's special place. There was a small wooden chair, some old books stacked in the corner, and a metal box sitting right in the center of the floor.
What kind of box?
An old toolbox, the kind with the red paint that's faded to pink. It had a simple latch, no lock. But it was heavy, Tony, much heavier than it should have been for its size.
Did Emma follow you up?
She was right behind me, asking a million questions. Whose house is this, Mom? Why didn't Great-Grandma Rose tell us about it? Can I play here? I was trying to answer her while staring at that box, trying to decide if I should open it with her there.
What made you hesitate?
Call it intuition, but something told me that box contained more than just old tools or childhood treasures. The way it was positioned, so deliberately in the center of the space. And there was this envelope tucked underneath it with my name written on it in Grandma Rose's handwriting.
Your name specifically?
Sarah, it said. Just my first name, but in her unmistakable script. She must have left it there knowing that someday I'd find this place. But when, Tony? And why keep it hidden for so long?
What did you tell Emma?
I told her we needed to be very careful, that this was like finding buried treasure, and we had to treat it with respect. She understood that. Emma's always been good at sensing when something is serious.
But you didn't open the box right away.
I couldn't. My hands were actually shaking as I held that envelope. Whatever was inside that box, whatever Grandma Rose had hidden up there, I knew it was going to change our lives. I just didn't know if it would be for better or worse.
So, what did you do?
I picked up the box, tucked the envelope into my pocket, and told Emma we were taking everything down to the house. I needed to process this somewhere safe, somewhere I could think clearly about what we'd stumbled into.
Sarah, you mentioned finding something in that treehouse that changed everything. Can you walk me through what happened that day?
Long pause. I still get chills thinking about it, Tony. I'd been avoiding the treehouse for weeks after we moved in. It looked so unstable, and honestly, I had bigger problems to worry about.
What finally made you decide to go up there?
My daughter Emma kept asking about it. She'd seen it from her bedroom window and thought it was magical. I figured I should at least check if it was safe before she tried climbing up on her own.
So this was purely about Emma's safety at first?
Exactly. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed that rickety ladder, expecting to find rotted wood and maybe some old bird nests. The whole structure creaked with every step.
What was your first impression when you got inside?
Disappointment, honestly. It was smaller than it looked from the ground, covered in dust and cobwebs. There were a few broken toys, some faded books. Nothing that screamed hidden treasure.
But something made you stay and look closer?
The floorboards. Some of them didn't sit quite right. I'm no carpenter, but when you've lived in enough cheap apartments with squeaky floors, you notice these things.
So, you decided to investigate?
I almost didn't. I kept thinking about all the unpacking I needed to do, the job applications I hadn't finished. But something about that uneven board kept nagging at me.
What did you use to pry it up?
There was an old crowbar in Grandmother's tool shed. Rusty thing, but it did the job. That first board came up easier than I expected, like it had been lifted before.
And underneath?
Pause, nothing at first, just dirt and darkness. I thought I'd wasted my time. But then the flashlight caught something metallic.
How did you feel in that moment, Sarah?
Confused more than anything. I reached down and pulled up this metal box about the size of a shoebox. Heavy. My hands were shaking as I set it on the floor.
Were you afraid to open it?
Terrified. In my experience, hidden things usually meant trouble. But curiosity won out. The latch was old but still worked.
What was the first thing you saw when you opened that box?
Money. Stacks and stacks of bills, wrapped in rubber bands. More cash than I'd ever seen in one place. My first thought was that I was dreaming.
How much are we talking about?
I didn't count it right away. I just stared. But there had to be thousands of dollars. Maybe tens of thousands. Enough to pay off every debt, fix the car, get Emma new clothes for school.
That must have been overwhelming.
I actually started crying, Tony. Here I was, 3 weeks behind on everything, eating ramen noodles for the 4th night in a row, and suddenly I'm looking at the answer to all my problems.
But there was more in that box, wasn't there?
Pause. Yes. Underneath the money, wrapped in plastic, were photographs. Old ones, black and white, and newspaper clippings, yellowed with age.
What were the photographs of?
People I didn't recognize at first. Men in suits, women in dresses from maybe the 50s or 60s. But one photo made my blood run cold.
Why? What did you see?
A man lying on the ground. Not sleeping, Tony. Dead. There was blood, and his eyes were open, staring at nothing.
What was your immediate reaction to seeing that?
I dropped the photo. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick it up again. This wasn't just hidden money. This was evidence of something terrible.
Did you look at the newspaper clippings right away?
I had to. The headlines were about a missing person from 1963. Robert Chen, a local businessman who disappeared without a trace.
The same man from the photograph?
I couldn't be sure, but the timeline matched. And there was something else in that box. A handwritten note that made everything worse.
What did it say?
Whispers they'll never find the body. The money is payment for silence. It was signed with initials I didn't recognize.
How long did you sit in that treehouse, Sarah, processing what you'd found?
Hours. The sun was setting when I finally climbed down. I kept thinking about Emma asking for new school supplies, about the eviction notice on my kitchen table. Then I'd remember that photograph, and I'd feel sick.
So you were torn between desperate need and moral obligation.
Exactly. I had the solution to all my financial problems in my hands, but it came with the weight of someone's death. Someone who might have a family still wondering what happened to him.
Sarah, let's talk about how you were coping during those early days after the discovery. Finding that kind of money when you're struggling financially, that must have created some intense internal conflict.
Long pause. You know, Tony, I kept telling myself I was being practical, weighing my options, but honestly, I was falling apart inside. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning thinking about my daughter's college applications, then immediately feel sick remembering that newspaper clipping.
Your daughter was applying to colleges during all this.
Emily was a senior that year, 17 years old, and so smart, Tony. She'd worked harder than any kid I knew, maintained perfect grades while working part-time to help with our expenses. She never complained, but I could see the worry in her eyes every time another rejection letter came from schools she couldn't afford.
That must have added enormous pressure to your decision about the money.
It was crushing me. Here I had enough cash hidden in my bedroom closet to send her anywhere she wanted to go, to give her the future she deserved. But every time I looked at those bills, I saw that photograph of the missing woman staring back at me.
How were you managing to keep this from Emily?
Pause. Badly. She started asking questions about why I seemed so distracted, why I kept making excuses not to help her with financial aid forms. One evening, she found me crying over our kitchen table covered with bills and scholarship applications.
What did you tell her?
I told her I was just worried about money, which wasn't really a lie. But Emily, she's always been intuitive. She sat down next to me and said, "Mom, we'll figure this out together. We always do." And that made it so much worse, Tony, because I knew I was sitting on a solution that might destroy everything.
Were you able to talk to anyone else about what you were going through?
That was the hardest part, the isolation. My best friend Lisa kept inviting me for coffee, but how do you casually mention you found a fortune that might be connected to murder? I started declining social invitations, avoiding phone calls.
That kind of secrecy can really wear on a person.
It was eating me alive. I'd always been someone who processed things by talking them through, but this felt too dangerous to share. I started having these conversations with my grandmother in my head, asking her what she would have wanted me to do.
Did those imaginary conversations provide any clarity?
Soft laugh. Sometimes I thought I heard her voice telling me to be brave, to do the right thing. Other times I was convinced she was warning me to protect Emily at all costs. My grandmother had lived through the Depression, Tony. She understood what it meant to sacrifice for family survival.
How was this stress affecting your daily life?
I was making mistakes at work, forgetting appointments. My supervisor pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay at home. I could barely concentrate on simple tasks because my mind was constantly cycling through scenarios. What if I kept the money? What if I reported it? What if whoever put it there came looking for it?
That last concern must have been particularly frightening.
Pause. That's when the real fear started settling in. I began noticing things. Cars that seemed to drive by the house too slowly. Phone calls where no one spoke when I answered. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I started double-checking locks and closing curtains earlier in the evening.
Were these fears affecting Emily too?
She started asking why I was acting so jumpy. One night she said, "Mom, you keep looking out the windows like you're expecting someone." It broke my heart because I was trying so hard to protect her from all this, but I was probably making her feel less safe instead of more.
How did you manage to keep functioning day to day?
Honestly, I'm not sure I was functioning well at all. I was running on adrenaline and maternal instinct. Every morning I'd make Emily breakfast and help her with college prep, going through the motions of normal life while feeling like I was living in 2 different realities.
2 realities?
The everyday world where we worried about grocery money and car repairs, and this shadow world where I was connected to something dark and dangerous from decades ago. Some days the normal world felt more real. Other days the weight of that secret made everything else seem like an act I was putting on.
At what point did you realize this situation was unsustainable?
Long pause. When I started researching the missing woman on my own. That's when everything changed, Tony. That's when I realized I wasn't just holding on to someone else's money. I was holding on to someone else's life.
Sarah, When you first held that evidence in your hands, the photographs, the documents, how did that change you as a person?
Long pause. You know, Tony, I think it split me in two. There was the Sarah who went into that treehouse looking for maybe some old toys or photo albums, and then there was this other Sarah who came out knowing someone had died violently. I remember my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold those pictures.
That's a profound shift. You mentioned your hands shaking. What was going through your mind in those first moments?
Fear, mostly. But also this strange sense of responsibility. Like my grandmother had left me more than just property. She'd left me a burden, a choice I wasn't prepared to make. I kept thinking about my daughter Emma, how she was upstairs probably doing homework, completely unaware that everything in our world had just shifted.
How do you even begin to process something like that? Here you are, a single mother dealing with your own financial struggles, and suddenly you're holding evidence of what appears to be a decades-old crime.
Pause. I didn't process it well, honestly. That first week, I barely slept. I'd put Emma to bed and then sit at my kitchen table, staring at those bundles of cash. $50,000, Tony. More money than I'd seen in my entire life, just sitting there on my table next to unpaid bills and past due notices.
The temptation must have been overwhelming.
It was torture. I'd pick up my electric bill, $140 past due, and then I'd look at that money. I could pay every debt, get Emma those school supplies she needed, maybe even start saving for her college. The rational part of me kept saying this money could change everything for us.
But something held you back from just taking it and walking away.
My conscience, I suppose, and my grandmother's voice in my head. She used to tell me that some things cost more than money. I didn't understand what she meant when I was younger, but sitting there with blood money on my table, I finally got it.
Tell me about Emma during this time. How were you managing to be her mother while carrying this secret?
Voice softens. That was the hardest part, Tony. Emma's always been perceptive. She started asking why I wasn't eating dinner, why I kept checking the locks on our doors. One night she found me crying over those photographs and asked if someone we knew had died. What do you tell a 14-year-old in that situation?
What did you tell her?
I said I was going through some of Grandma's old things, and they brought up difficult memories. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. The weight of keeping that secret from her was almost as heavy as the secret itself.
During this time, were you able to reach out to anyone for support?
Who could I reach out to? I couldn't exactly call a friend and say, "Hey, I found evidence of a murder and a pile of cash, what should I do?" I felt completely isolated. Even at work, I was just going through the motions, smiling at customers while my mind was spinning with possibilities and fears.
Work must have been particularly challenging. You mentioned you were barely keeping things together financially even before this discovery.
Bitter laugh. I was working 2 jobs then, mornings at the diner and evenings cleaning offices. Both jobs barely above minimum wage. My manager at the diner, she pulled me aside one day and asked if everything was okay at home. Said I seemed distracted, that I'd mixed up 3 orders that morning.
How did you handle that conversation?
I told her I was dealing with my grandmother's estate, which was true enough. But Tony, I remember standing in that restaurant bathroom afterward, looking at myself in the mirror, wondering if this is what people look like when they're losing their minds. My reflection looked like a stranger.
Sarah, looking back now, do you think finding that money and evidence changed your relationship with trust, with how you view the world?
Long pause, absolutely. Before that treehouse, I believed that doing the right thing would eventually lead to good things. I had faith that if I worked hard and raised Emma well, we'd be okay. But holding that evidence, seeing what someone was capable of, realizing that evil could hide for decades, it shattered something innocent in me that I don't think I'll ever get back.
That's a profound loss in its own way.
It is. And the cruelest part was knowing that whoever put that money there, whoever was connected to that crime, they were still out there. They'd been living their life while I struggled to pay rent. That felt like the deepest injustice of all.
Sarah, when you found that evidence alongside the money, something shifted for you, didn't it? The way you talk about that moment, it sounds like more than just shock.
Long pause. Tony, I think that was the first time in my adult life I truly understood what my grandmother meant when, She used to say that some secrets choose their own time to surface. I was holding this yellowed envelope, and my hands were actually trembling.
What was going through your mind as you opened it?
I kept thinking about Emma, my daughter, and how she was probably finishing her homework downstairs, completely unaware that her mother was sitting in a treehouse holding what might be evidence of a crime. Part of me wanted to just put it back, pretend I'd never seen it.
But you didn't.
No. And I think that decision says something about who I was becoming versus who I'd always been. The old Sarah would have walked away, the Sarah who spent years making herself smaller, avoiding confrontation, choosing the safe path.
This feels like a turning point in your story. Tell me what you found.
Pause photographs, Tony. Black and white photographs that looked like they were taken in the 1970s. A woman I didn't recognize, but she was clearly in distress in some of them. And there were handwritten notes in what I later confirmed was my grandmother's handwriting.
Your grandmother was documenting something.
She was. The notes mentioned dates, times, license plate numbers. There was a name I didn't recognize, Richard Holbrook, and there were references to threatening behavior, to someone being scared, to my grandmother, feeling like she needed to keep a record.
How did that make you feel about your grandmother, this woman who raised you?
Emotional. That's what haunts me, Tony. I thought I knew her completely. She was this gentle, quiet woman who made the best apple pie and never missed one of my school plays. But reading those notes, I realized there was this whole part of her life that she kept hidden from everyone.
Perhaps she was protecting you.
I've thought about that. But sitting in that treehouse, surrounded by all this evidence of her secret vigilance, I felt this strange mixture of pride and grief. Pride that she had been brave enough to document something dangerous. Grief that she had carried this burden alone.
Did the notes connect to the money in any way?
Not directly in what I read that night, but there were references to making things right and insurance for the future. I began to understand that my grandmother had been watching something unfold, something that made her feel responsible for protecting not just herself, but future generations.
You mean you and Emma?
Exactly. And that realization changed how I saw my own situation. Here I was, worried about making rent and keeping Emma in good schools, and my grandmother had been playing some kind of long game to ensure we'd have resources when we needed them most.
But resources obtained how, Sarah? That had to be weighing on you.
Pause. That's the question that kept me awake that entire night. I came down from the treehouse around midnight, and I just sat in my grandmother's old kitchen staring at those photographs and notes spread across the table.
What conclusions were you drawing?
I kept thinking about legacy, Tony. About what we pass down to our children and grandchildren. My grandmother had passed down this property, but she'd also passed down this mystery, this responsibility.
Did you consider going to the police at that point?
I did. I actually picked up the phone twice. But then I'd think about Emma, about her college fund that didn't exist, about the medical bills from her father's accident that were still following us around.
The money represented security.
More than security, it represented choices. The ability to say yes when Emma asked if she could take that art class, or go on that school trip, or apply to colleges without worrying about scholarships covering everything.
But you're describing a practical consideration competing with a moral one.
Size, that's exactly right. And I think that conflict is something people our age understand in a way younger people might not. When you've lived through real financial fear, when you've had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying your child new shoes, the moral calculus becomes more complicated.
Your grandmother must have faced a similar dilemma.
I think she did. Reading her notes, I could sense her wrestling with something. There were entries that seemed to go back and forth between anger and fear and this sense of duty.
Did her notes give you any sense of timeline, when these events occurred?
Based on the dates I could make out, this all seemed to happen in the mid-1970s. I would have been very young, maybe 5 or 6. I have vague memories of my grandmother seeming more anxious during that period, being more careful about locking doors, asking more questions about where I was going to play.
She was protecting you even then.
She was. And that night, sitting with her documentation of whatever she had witnessed or been part of, I felt this incredible connection to her courage, but also this weight of responsibility.
Because now it was your turn to make difficult choices.
Exactly. And Tony, I want to be honest about something. Part of me was angry with her. Angry that she had left me this impossible situation. Why couldn't she have just left me a normal inheritance? Why did it have to come with all this moral complexity?
That anger seems completely understandable.
But as the night went on, as I read through more of her notes, I began to see that she probably struggled with the same anger. There were several entries where she seemed to be writing to someone, maybe to me, maybe to Emma, maybe to herself.
What did those entries say?
Emotional. One of them said, "Some burdens cannot be avoided, only accepted with grace." Another said, "The money is not the point. The point is ensuring that truth has a chance to surface when the time is right."
She saw herself as a guardian of truth.
Yes. And I think she was hoping that whoever inherited this responsibility would have the wisdom and courage she felt she had lacked in her own time.
That's an enormous burden to place on someone.
It is. But sitting there that night, I also began to understand that maybe this was her way of trusting me, of believing that I was capable of handling something she couldn't resolve herself.
How did that realization affect your decision-making process?
Long pause. It made me realize that this wasn't really about the money anymore, Tony. This was about honoring my grandmother's faith in me and figuring out what kind of legacy I wanted to create for Emma.
Sarah, when you found those documents alongside the money, what went through your mind first? The practical implications or the human cost?
Long pause. You know, Tony, I think for the first few minutes I couldn't process either. I just sat there in that treehouse holding these yellowed papers, and all I could think about was my grandmother's hands. How she must have touched these same documents, made these same discoveries.
Tell me about what those papers revealed.
There were bank records, Tony. Transactions from 1987, all in amounts just under $10,000. Someone was being very careful to avoid federal reporting requirements. And then there were the letters.
Letters?
3 of them, in my grandmother's handwriting. She'd been documenting everything she suspected about the missing woman, Elena Vasquez. My grandmother had pieced together that Elena had stumbled onto some kind of money laundering operation at the construction company where she worked part-time.
Your grandmother was conducting her own investigation?
That's exactly what she was doing. And Sarah, reading those letters, I realized she'd been carrying this burden for decades. She wrote about sleepless nights, about seeing Elena's children grow up without their mother, about the guilt of not coming forward.
What stopped her from going to the police?
Fear, Tony. Pure fear. In one letter, she described a phone call she received after asking too many questions around town. A man's voice telling her that accidents happen to curious people, that her granddaughter, me, was such a lovely child, and it would be terrible if something happened to me.
So she chose your safety over justice.
Voice breaking slightly. She chose me, Tony. Every day for 35 years, she chose me. And sitting in that treehouse, holding that money that could solve all my problems, I finally understood the weight she'd been carrying.
How did that realization change your perspective on the money?
It stopped being about me, about my bills and my daughter's future. It became about Elena Vasquez, about her children who never knew what happened to their mother, about my grandmother who died with this secret, eating away at her soul.
But you still had very real financial pressures.
God, yes. Tony, that morning I'd gotten another notice about the house. My daughter Emma had been asking why we never went out for ice cream anymore, why all her friends had new backpacks but hers had tape holding it together. The money was right there, enough to fix everything.
What did you do in that moment?
I called in sick to work and spent the entire day in that treehouse, reading everything over and over. I found myself talking to my grandmother, asking her what she would want me to do. And then I started thinking about Elena's family, about whether they were still alive, still wondering.
Did you research Elena's family?
I drove to the library that evening and used their computer. Tony, Elena had 2 children when she disappeared, a son and a daughter, 8 and 6 years old. They would be in their 40s now, probably with families of their own.
That must have made the decision more complicated.
It crystallized everything, actually. I found an obituary for Elena's mother from 2019. It mentioned that she'd never stopped hoping for answers about her daughter's disappearance. She died not knowing, Tony, just like my grandmother lived not telling.
How do you think this discovery changed you fundamentally?
Pause. I think it made me realize that some things are bigger than our immediate problems. My grandmother taught me that through her silence, and Elena taught me that through her absence. Money can solve financial problems, but it can't solve the problem of living with yourself afterward.
What about Emma? How do you balance being her mother with this moral obligation?
That's the question that kept me awake that night, Tony. But then I realized, what kind of mother would I be if I taught her that we only do the right thing when it's convenient? That we only seek justice when it doesn't cost us anything?
So you'd made your decision.
I'd made my decision about what needed to happen eventually, but I hadn't figured out how to do it safely. Because, Tony, if someone had threatened my grandmother 35 years ago, and if that money was still hidden away, it meant the danger might still be real.
The people responsible might still be around.
Exactly. And now I had Emma to protect, just like my grandmother had protected me. I was starting to understand that sometimes the right choice and the safe choice aren't the same thing.
Sarah, you mentioned finding those documents in the treehouse alongside the money. What exactly did they contain?
Long pause. That's when everything I thought I knew about my grandmother started to unravel, Tony. There were bank statements, withdrawal slips, all dating back to 1987. Large amounts of cash being taken out systematically over several months.
From your grandmother's account?
That's what I assumed at first. But then I found a letter tucked behind one of the statements. It was addressed to my grandmother, but it wasn't signed by anyone I recognized. It talked about keeping the secret and protecting the family.
What kind of protection?
The letter mentioned my father, Tony. My father, who supposedly died in a car accident when I was 3. But this letter was dated 2 years after his death.
Pause. Are you saying your father might have been alive when you thought he was dead?
I didn't know what to think. I called my Aunt Margaret that night. She's my grandmother's youngest daughter, the only one still living. I asked her directly about the letter, about the money.
How did she respond?
She went completely silent for almost a minute. Then she said something that changed everything. She said, "Your grandmother never told you the truth about your father because she was protecting you."
What truth was that?
My father wasn't the victim of that car accident, Tony. He was the cause of it. He'd been drinking, ran a red light, and killed a young mother and her 6-year-old daughter. The other family was the Hendersons.
The same Henderson family you mentioned before, the ones with connections to your grandmother's neighborhood.
Exactly. But here's the part that made my blood run cold. My aunt told me that after the accident, my father disappeared. He never faced trial, never served time. The official story was that he died in the crash, but his body was never recovered from the river.
So, the money in the treehouse.
Margaret explained that my grandmother had been paying the Henderson family for years. Not officially, not through any legal settlement. It was guilt money, Tony, blood money. My grandmother felt responsible for what my father had done.
And she continued these payments even after your father's supposed death?
For decades. Every month she would withdraw money and leave it at a designated location. The Hendersons never pursued legal action because they were receiving these payments. My grandmother was buying their silence and trying to ease her own conscience.
But Sarah, that means the money you found
Was probably one of the last payments she was supposed to make before she died. She must have hidden it in the treehouse when she got too sick to make the drop.
How did this revelation change your perspective on everything that had happened?
Suddenly, the man who had been watching my house, the sense that someone was searching for something, it all made sense. The Henderson family knew about these payments. When they stopped coming after my grandmother's death, they must have started looking for the money.
Did your aunt know how much your grandmother had paid over the years?
She estimated it was close to $200,000 over 30 years. My grandmother had been living in poverty, Tony. Not because she was poor, but because she was giving away almost everything she had.
And your father? Do you believe he's actually dead?
Pause, Margaret thinks so. She believes he probably took his own life after the accident, somewhere far from home. The guilt of what he'd done, leaving behind a wife and young daughter. But his body was never found.
How did learning all this affect your decision about the money?
It wasn't really my money anymore, was it? It belonged to a family that had lost a mother and daughter because of my father's choices. My grandmother had been trying to make amends the only way she knew how.
But you were struggling financially. Your own daughter needed things.
That's what made it so difficult, Tony. Part of me wanted to rationalize keeping it. My grandmother was gone. The original victims were gone. But their family was still here, still living with that loss.
What did you decide to do?
I realized I needed to meet them face to face. The Henderson family deserved to know what had happened to the payments, and I deserved to understand the full weight of what my family had done to theirs.
That must have been a terrifying prospect.
Terrifying and necessary. Because I was beginning to understand that some secrets don't die with the people who keep them. They just get passed down to the next generation.
Sarah, when you found those documents with the money, what exactly did they reveal about your grandmother's connection to all this?
Long pause. That's when everything I thought I knew crumbled, Tony. The papers weren't just evidence of someone else's crime. They were receipts, bank records, correspondence, all in my grandmother's handwriting.
Your grandmother was involved in whatever happened to create that hidden stash.
More than involved. She was the one who took the money in the first place. There were letters between her and a man named Vincent Carlucci, dated from 1987. Apparently she'd been keeping books for his construction company, skimming funds over several years.
And the murder you mentioned earlier.
Vincent found out about the theft. The final letter was him threatening to expose her, demanding she meet him at the old quarry to return everything. That was dated 3 days before the newspaper reported him missing.
Pause, Sarah. Are you saying your grandmother?
I don't know what happened at that quarry, Tony. But Vincent Carlucci was never seen again, and my grandmother suddenly had enough money to pay off her house and start her flower shop. Money she told everyone came from a life insurance policy that never existed.
How did this change your perspective on the woman who raised you?
Everything made sense, suddenly. Why she never talked about those years. Why she'd get so anxious whenever crime stories came on the news. Why she made me promise to always tell the truth, no matter how difficult. Voice-breaking, she was trying to save me from becoming what she'd become.
But you were faced with the same choice she once made.
Exactly. Here I was, desperate for money to save my son's future, holding cash that could solve everything. Just like she must have felt when she first started taking from Vincent's accounts.
Did you consider that maybe she was trying to protect you by hiding this truth even in death?
That's what made it so cruel, Tony. She'd hidden the money where she knew I'd find it, but she'd also left the evidence of what it really was. It felt like a test, like she was asking me to choose between financial salvation and moral integrity.
The same choice that had haunted her for decades.
And now I understood why she'd seemed so burdened all those years.
Sarah, you mentioned earlier that you had made your decision about the money. But sitting there in that treehouse, knowing someone had already tried to hurt you once, what was really going through your mind?
Long pause fear, if I'm being honest, Tony. Not just for myself, but for Emma. I kept thinking about my grandmother, how she must have carried this burden for decades.
Did you consider just taking the money and walking away? Forgetting everything else you'd found?
Of course I did. God, Tony, do you know what that money could have meant for us? Emma's college fund, a real home, security I'd never been able to give her.
But something stopped you.
My grandmother's journal. I sat there reading her words again, about how the silence ate at her, how she regretted not speaking up when it might have mattered.
What did she write exactly, if you don't mind sharing?
Voice softening. She wrote, "Some secrets become poison if you hold them too long. I should have been braver. That hit me hard, Tony. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering if I was a coward."
So you started planning your next move right there in the treehouse?
I called my friend Detective Martinez first. Told her everything. The money, the evidence, the attack. She said she'd been hoping someone would come forward about this case for years.
That must have felt like a weight lifting.
It did. But then the real fear set in. Martinez warned me that whoever killed that man was still out there, still protecting their secret. She said once we moved forward, there'd be no going back.
How did you prepare Emma for what was coming?
Pause. That was the hardest part, Tony. How do you tell your daughter that the inheritance that could change your lives might also put you both in danger?
What did you tell her?
The truth. That sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you want to pay, but the cost of not doing it is even higher. She looked at me and said, "Mom, Grandma would want us to be brave."
Smart girl.
She is. And that night, as we packed our bags to stay at Martinez's safe house, I knew we were about to face whatever came next together.
The calm before the storm.
Exactly, Tony. But for the first time in months, I felt like we were on the right side of this fight.
Sarah, you're sitting here now telling this story with such composure, but I have to ask, in those final hours before everything came to a head, what was going through your mind?
Long pause. You know, Tony, there's a strange clarity that comes when you realize you've run out of options. I kept thinking about my daughter Emma, about the kind of mother I wanted her to remember.
That must have been an enormous weight to carry. How did you prepare yourself for what you knew was coming?
I spent that last night in the treehouse, actually. Just sitting there with all those old photographs, trying to understand my grandmother's choices. She'd kept this secret for 60 years, Tony. 60 years of living with what she knew.
What do you think gave you the strength to make a different choice?
Emma. When I looked at those pictures of the victim's family, I saw Emma's face. I saw myself. I realized that some things matter more than money, more than safety, more than the comfortable lies we tell ourselves.
You mentioned earlier that you'd been contacted again. How did you handle that pressure?
Pause. I stopped running from it. I called Detective Martinez back, told him I was ready to talk, but I also knew whoever was watching me wasn't going to just let that happen.
That took incredible courage, Sarah. What was your plan?
Plan? Soft laugh. I wish I could say I had some brilliant strategy, Tony, but honestly, my plan was to do the right thing and hope I lived long enough to see Emma graduate high school.
How did you explain the situation to Emma? She was what, 16 at the time?
I told her the truth. Maybe not every detail, but enough. I said her great-grandmother had left us something more complicated than money, and that we had to decide what kind of people we wanted to be.
And how did she respond to that?
She said something I'll never forget. She looked at me and said, "Mom, we've been poor this long. We can be poor a little longer if it means we can sleep at night."
Wise words from a 16-year-old.
She was always wiser than me, Tony. That conversation gave me everything I needed to face what was coming. I knew that whatever happened, I was making the choice my daughter could live with. The choice I could live with.
So, you made the call to Detective Martinez.
I made the call.
Sarah, you're standing there in that treehouse with decades of secrets around you. What's going through your mind in that moment?
Everything felt frozen, Tony. Like time had stopped between what my life was and what it could become. I kept thinking about my daughter's college fund, our empty refrigerator, the eviction notice.
But there was something else weighing on you too, wasn't there?
The photographs. That poor woman's face staring back at me from those old pictures. Someone's daughter, someone's mother, maybe. She deserved justice, didn't she?
How do you weigh that against your own family's survival?
Long pause. You know, I thought about my grandmother in that moment. Why she kept those bundles hidden all these years. Was she protecting someone? Or was she too afraid to speak up?
What do you think the answer was?
Fear, pure fear. She knew what happened to people who crossed certain lines in this town. But she couldn't bring herself to destroy the evidence either.
So, she left that burden for you to carry.
Or maybe she left me a choice she never felt she had. The money or the truth. Not both.
When you picked up that photograph again, what did you decide?
I looked at this woman's eyes, and I saw myself. Another mother trying to survive in a world that doesn't always protect the vulnerable. How could I take blood money and sleep at night?
Even knowing what it would cost you.
My daughter was going to learn about integrity from someone, Tony. Better it be from me making the hard choice than from watching me take the easy one.
So you made your decision.
I gathered every piece of evidence, every photograph, every document, every bundle with its awful history. I was going to take it all to the police.
Past tense, Sarah. What changed?
Pause. I heard footsteps on the treehouse ladder, heavy ones. Someone had been watching, waiting to see what I'd do.
Who was it?
The one person in town who knew exactly what was hidden up there. The one person who'd been waiting 30 years for someone to find it.
And suddenly you realized the real danger wasn't in the past.
It was climbing right up toward me.
Sarah, you're standing there with evidence that could solve a decades-old murder. What's going through your mind?
I keep thinking about my grandmother, Tony. All those years she carried this secret, the weight of it.
And now that weight has passed to you.
Pause. The money could change everything for my kids. College, a real home, security I've never been able to give them.
But
But keeping it means becoming her. Living with blood money, looking over my shoulder forever.
what do you think she would want you to do?
Long pause. She saved those newspaper clippings, Tony. Every article about the missing girl. She kept them for 40 years.
That tells you something.
She was waiting for someone brave enough to do what she couldn't. Voice breaking. She was waiting for me.
So what happens now?
I make the call. I choose truth over comfort, justice over security. I choose the woman I want my children to remember.
So here we are, Sarah, 6 months later. How do you sleep at night now?
Better than I have in years, Tony. The kids are settled in our new place. Emma's getting the tutoring she needs. And Jake, well, he's stopped asking why we can't afford things.
And the weight of what you carried all those months?
Long pause. You know, I thought keeping that secret would destroy me. But it was the opposite. Carrying it alone was what was killing me. Once the truth came out, once justice finally happened, I felt lighter.
Your grandmother would be proud.
I think so. She kept that evidence for 60 years, Tony, waiting for someone brave enough to use it. I'm just glad it was me who found it.
What's next for the woman who solved a decades-old murder?
Laugh softly. I'm going back to school. Nursing program. Turns out I'm stronger than I thought I was.
Indeed you are, Sarah. Indeed you are. So here we are, Sarah, 6 months later. When you look back at that first day in the treehouse, what stands out most?
The silence, Tony. How quiet everything became when I lifted those boards. Like the world was holding its breath.
And now? How does that silence feel?
Different. Peaceful, maybe. Emma's college fund is secure. The Hendersons finally have answers about their father. And I sleep through the night again.
You've said the money changed your circumstances, but what changed inside you?
I learned I'm stronger than I thought. That doing the right thing doesn't always feel right in the moment, but it settles something deep down.
Any regrets about how it all unfolded?
None. Well, maybe one. I wish Grandma Rose could have seen Emma graduate next spring. She would have been so proud.
I think she knows, Sarah. Some legacies run deeper than money or secrets.
Softly, yes. Some do.